so my expectation is that what we will have 15 years from now is a much larger number of congregations that at one time were Messianic Jewish synagogues in some sense, and are really no longer that. Some of them may cease to exist, but I think a number of them might continue. They might continue to even call themselves Messianic congregations. But the reality is that they become something more like a Jewish roots church. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've come to think that there's a place for Jewish roots churches, particularly if they honor those two basic values or convictions that I articulated in the previous session. To honor the Jew-Gentile distinction on the one hand, and to honor the heritage of the church on the other. Within that framework, churches that are putting the Jewish heritage of the good news front and center, and see it as something of their own mission, to let the rest of the church have to deal more directly with replacement theology and with dealing with supersessionism and antinomianism. This could be a good thing, particularly if they're able to, in some ways, shift out of identifying themselves as a Messianic Jewish congregation. I think that what will be left is a certain set of congregations that are strong and dynamic and healthy. We have some. Ruach obviously is like that. The congregation that Rabbi Seth and Rachel lead in North Carolina. Clearly, remember, I haven't been there, but everybody tells me this is a really going place. We've got some congregations like this. But I think we need to drop the expectation that we're going to be able to go to any major city in the United States, and there should be a Messianic synagogue there that we would all want to go to and think that we should be going to. And that's been our expectation, that if we don't reach that as a goal, we've failed. I'm not convinced that that is an attainable goal, or at this point should be a goal. I think we need such synagogues. What I want to convey about it, though, is I think that these synagogues, and I want to use a word that Rabbi Rich used yesterday in some context, that I think is really a key word here. And it's the word hub. I think we need certain synagogues that function like hubs. You know how hubs work in with airlines, you know, where they route flights through these places, you know. We need a certain set of key hubs in key regions around the country that become places that are regional centers. They're not just a local synagogue that's serving the people in that city. I think, again, the fact of being able to do an event like this, again, signifies something of that Ruach already functions in this way. You know, it is a hub congregation. It can do an event like this, which is a regional event or even a national event. People come to it and then go back to other places and take home with them something that they've received. So I think that the synagogue as a model needs to be preserved, but that our expectations about what it is and it's what its function is needs to change. And this then leads into the second model, of course, which we talked about also earlier, the Chavurah model. I think the Chavurah model, in some ways in the future, ought to be viewed as more the basic model. We've tended to think of the synagogue model as the basic model, and the Chavurah as this ancillary thing for people who couldn't have synagogues. I tend to think that we should shift our thinking and have the Chavurah as the basic model. And then relate to the Chavurot, not as simply a set of these independent groupings that are all over the place, but see these Chavurot in relationship to hubs. And now what I'm going to talk about is, I think actually the type, what I intend by a hub could be more than a synagogue. I don't think synagogues are the only entities that can function as what I'm talking about as a hub. I'm going to, as I said, I'll give you some other illustrations of what I think could function in that way. But I've already talked about the synagogue. You can imagine, again, someone being in a chavurah, being linked in some way to a rabbi or a staff member from a synagogue that could be near and perhaps far, whatever. Having contact with that person, relating to that person as their rabbi in some ways, a rabbi overseeing this particular chavurah, and then members of the chavurah going to that hub community a certain number of times in the year, having a regular relationship. It's understood there's a kind of a commitment or a bond that exists between them, and they're serving one another. Perhaps every once in a while the regional group would have a kind of an event like this, or a conference where all the chavurot that are linked to that particular hub come together and have an event and develop a kind of community sense among themselves, so that you don't simply have the national movement with the national conferences, or just like regional conferences of synagogues that happen to be in a particular region, but that things are centered around these major congregations or other kinds of communities that function in this way as hubs. So that I think if chavurot are to really be successful, they need something beyond themselves. They need to be connected to some other community which is larger and has a more holistic life. Now, for chavurot, I'm not going to give any formula for you for chavurot. I think chavurot could consist of any number of different types of groupings, and that each one would need to figure out what it wants to be. I think part of what is freeing or liberating about the chavurah is it doesn't have to try to do everything that a synagogue does. It doesn't have to have a building. It doesn't have to have full-time staff members. It also can exercise more control over who participates in it. Again, one of the limitations, as I see it, of the synagogue model is a synagogue is a kind of entity where you expect that if somebody comes to you, then they're received. That's clearly the case in a church model. A synagogue, a traditional synagogue, exercises a little bit more, is able to exercise a little bit more control over who's coming in and whether or not someone's accepted as a member. But our synagogues, by and large, haven't done that very well. I think that we could do it better, but still, a synagogue by its very nature is a kind of holistic community that has people of all different ages and all different types. And so, it's not going to be screening its members. A chavurah, I think, should, in some sense. It should decide, the core members who are starting it should decide what kind of group do they want to be. And then membership should really be by invitation, so that the group is able to preserve its character. And part of the strength, I think, of the chavurah is that it can do that. A chavurah can decide what kind of group it's going to be. Some chavurot might be only Jews, might decide that's what they want to be. Another chavurah might decide, no, we want to be able to have some non-Jews, some Gentiles who are very supportive of what we're doing, who can make this work. But the numbers could be more carefully moderated than they can in a synagogue context. Some Chavurot might consist of people who are attending traditional synagogues. That's what we have in Israel. There are these Chavurot of people who attend synagogues in their areas. And then the Chavurah is their way of giving support to their life in Yeshua. There might be other Chavurot that consist of Jews who are participating in churches. And the purpose of the Chavurah is to support their Jewish life, to give them something that they can't possibly get within their church context. Other Chavurot might feel like they could combine these two. Might be a little tricky, because then you have to both be focusing on adding the Yeshua dimension for those folks and the Torah, Israel, Jewish connection for the others, but it might be possible. You can just see there's a lot of different options. Each Chavurah might have a sense of a kind of mission, of something it wants to do, in addition to simply being a support group. And it might involve some kind of outreach work. It might involve some kind of care for the poor, or something like that. Every Chavurah will not do everything. Each Chavurah has to decide what does it exist for, what is its purpose, etc. But it has the flexibility to do that. So that's the Chavurah model, which again, the key part, as I'm trying to present it, is nothing radically new about what a Chavurah is. It's seeing it in relationship to other communities that can serve as a hub. The third type of model is something I alluded to earlier today. And this term intentional community has been used in the past. I don't even know if it's still being used. It is still being used? Okay. It's a term that's been around, though, for a long time. I was part of something that you could call an intentional community for 20 years of my life. I was part of actually an intentional community within an intentional community. Because the community I was part of was a family community that actually had a couple thousand people in it. And then within that community, there was a celibate brotherhood. And I was part of that group for a number of years. Now, in some of those years, for all of those years, the group of men that I was part of, we had all of our goods in common. I own nothing of my own as an individual. And we made long-term commitments to one another and to a common life. But we served within a bigger community. That was a family community, as I said. And during one period, that family community had about maybe 100 to 200 people who were also living with their goods in common. And now, that was a bit unwieldy, and it ended up not continuing in that pattern. But the normal units within the family community would be a family with usually maybe 4 or 5 single people living with them. Usually, a couple men, couple women with a family. And in our community, we never had men and women simply as singles living together, but we would always have a family that was the base of a household. And then what we did was we encouraged these family units to try to find houses close to one another. And we call those neighborhood clusters. And so actually, for a period of time, I was leading a Messianic Jewish neighborhood cluster. Because this ecumenical community I was part of was very supportive of our trying to do something on the Messianic Jewish front. And so we did, starting in 1980, for a few years. I had a household of the single guys who were with me, I was the only Jew in the midst of that house, but the other guys were all studying Hebrew and keeping kosher and doing all of that to support me in my life. Really much the way I've talked about non-Jews entering into a Messianic Jewish context in order simply to be able to support what's going on with the Jews. So we had our household, and then we had 4 or 5 other families who lived in the neighborhood. 3 of the family units were Messianic Jewish homes, and then 2 of the families were Gentiles who, again, were committed to support us in the work. And we would meet for Shabbat, Friday night, every week. So this gives you a feel of like what we were trying to do for a period of time. I think that there are 2 essential components of intentional community. And they're components which I don't know that we have them, both of them existing anywhere right now in the Messianic Jewish movement. The first is proximity, basically living so close to one another that you can do things together as families or as just individuals without having to drive. That you're simply able to get together, and that your life together is a daily life rather than a weekly life. I think in a Messianic Jewish context, it means being able to daven together regularly, to be able to have a minyan that's more like a daily minyan rather than just weekly, which you could do if, again, you had enough people together in a neighborhood. And again, it's functioning in many ways more like an Orthodox Jewish community where people have to live close to one another because they can't drive on Shabbat. This is one of those halachic matters where, the Orthodox restriction forces them to have community. Because we don't adhere to that kind of halacha, we're not compelled. At a certain point a few years ago, the chancellor at Jewish Theological Seminary was bemoaning the fact that the conservative movement permitted driving on Shabbat. The reason he was bemoaning it wasn't because he thought halachically it was improper or wrong. It was because practically it lost that sense of a close neighborhood community that not being able to drive on Shabbat forced in some ways. Orthodox communities have to be intentional. If they're going to move their synagogue, the whole community is going to have to move their houses. That's an intentional community. So proximity, but the second element that's required is stability, long-term relationships. Long-term relationships, commitment that's more than just commitment for a year or 2. A community relationship, intentional community, is like family relationship. And we use the metaphor of family all the time when we're talking about synagogues and congregations, but the reality is that's not what they are. People come and people go, and when they go, sometimes they keep some kind of relationship, and a lot of times they don't. With a family, even when someone has to move away, it doesn't make any difference. They're going to be your family for the rest of your life, and you know it. And you know that when someone's getting married, you're going to be there for the wedding. When someone dies, you're going to be there for the funeral. When it's Thanksgiving or whatever, the family comes together wherever you are. Long-term, stable relationships is essential to community, in part because only through those sorts of relationships do you really build the kind of trust that Rabbi Rich was talking about today in his message. And that kind of trust is the essence of intimacy, and intimacy is the heart of community, lives that are joined together. Now, there are this notion of stability of long-term relationship. I've experienced that with my my friends and colleagues in Hashivenu and the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. So I think one of the main reasons that fruit has been born from things that we've done is that Rabbi Rich and Rabbi Stewart, Rabbi Michael, Rabbi Paul, myself, and a set of others, we've hung together, and it's been 20 years, and we've had our ups and downs, I can assure you. That's the way it's going to be in any group of people. But we've stuck together, and I think fruit has been born because of it. We don't have the proximity, and so we're not the kind of intentional community I'm talking about, but that's a sign of what can come out of longer-term relationships. And so when you put proximity together with a sense of commitment, you have a potent mix. It's also, I want to be very honest with you, it's also a very risky business. I don't want to hide that from you. I've kept up close relationships with the people in the community I was part of. That community went through this. I'm no longer part of it because it went through a major split, and hundreds of people's lives were affected by that. It's like marriage. It's like family. Every marriage is a risky business too. It can produce something absolutely unique and essential to human life, and when it goes wrong, it can cause more pain than anything else. Communities like that too, and because of that, you have to enter into it with just as much wisdom and care as you do in choosing a spouse, because of its power, both for good and to cause damage. So I'm not trying to give a pep talk for intentional community, or I say, okay, everybody go out and sign up. We'll apportion who is where. That's not what I'm saying. This is a very, very serious business. But my hope is that at some point in the next century, some group of Messianic Jews decide that they're going to take that risk. Because when you do, and when it works, it is extraordinary, truly extraordinary. In the heyday of our community, we had thousands of people from all over the world visiting us. And they, basically they took what they saw and they went home. And new communities emerged all over the world through what they saw among us. Students would join and be with us for a year. There was in the early years in the early 1970s, there was a guy who was doing graduate work at the University of Michigan from Lebanon, and he entered into the life of the community in Ann Arbor. He went home, started a community in Beirut, and they went through the entire war together. And now they have started communities in various places throughout the Middle East, and they are probably the most dynamic Christian movement in Lebanon today. These are the things that can happen when a set of people make the sacrifices that are required. Now, if we had even just one or two or three intentional Messianic Jewish communities that could again function as hubs in the way in which synagogues could, as I talked about earlier. But the advantage they would have is it wouldn't be just a matter of coming for a weekend. One of the key things, I think, in an intentional community is to have a guest house. You have a guest house because one of the main functions is to have people sharing your life for periods of time and to let them experience it. You model it. You develop, you put an intentional Messianic Jewish community, I think, would have to put a great deal of investment in its liturgical life, in its worship life. The idea is, though, then people could come and actually, in a daily way, experience that. And then they go home, and who knows what comes from it. There's a lot more I could say about this one, obviously, because it was a very big part of my own life. And as I said, it's something I think that we need at some point. The closest thing to it maybe that I'm aware of that at one time existed in the Messianic Jewish movement, it had the proximity, it had the dynamism, but it didn't have necessarily the long-term commitment, was Beth Yeshua in Philadelphia in the early years in the 1970s of the Messianic Jewish movement. It was one neighborhood, so people were living close to one another, and it was so dynamic. You had people from all over the country who would visit, but also who would move there. An intentional community doesn't primarily, of this sort, wouldn't necessarily primarily grow just through its own region. It would grow in part through people visiting it from other places around the country, staying for a week or two, and eventually deciding that it was so attractive and it caught so much their heart, their vision, that they were going to make the sacrifice and move and be part of it. That's the way it worked, again, in the community that I was part of. That's the way it worked in Beth Yeshua. I think it could happen in the future in another Messianic Jewish intentional community. Now, I wanted to go back to actually, before I pick up the ecumenical community model, I wanted to go back to the Chavurah model and say one thing. Another type of Chavurah that I think could develop, which is I don't see it as quite as, I see it as a bit of a concession rather than ideal. But I think it's going to be necessary, which is a virtual Chavurah. I think we will need a virtual Chavurot because we will have Messianic Jewish people in scattered places around the country who have a common vision and a common ideal and have no support. And in that kind of context, we have to find ways to link people together. Ideally, again, I would say in relationship to a hub, to a synagogue, to an intentional community, to some entity that has a set of leaders that can be overseeing it. And again, with those members of that Chavurah being able to come together in relationship to that hub, that synagogue or that intentional community at some times during the year and have face-to-face experience of their relationships. But I think that in this case we have to find a way to make the social media and the internet work to promote community. This fourth model is really relates to what I talked about in relationship to the Helsinki consultation. It's this idea that there may be either chavurot or even intentional communities that might emerge in the future that are ecumenical in nature, that bring together Messianic Jews with Jews in a church context, maybe even Jewish Catholics or Jews who are in the Orthodox Church. And again, if something is an intentional community, it doesn't have to actually be a synagogue. It doesn't have to meet on Saturday. You know, it's possible, like a chavurah for an intentional community, like our community as an ecumenical community, our meetings were on Sunday afternoons, so they wouldn't conflict with anything that anybody was doing. I went to the conservative synagogue on Saturday morning, and most of the other folks went on Sunday morning to some church, and the community met on Sunday afternoons. You know, you could have and envision an ecumenical, messianic, intentional community, but it would mean that all of its members were so invested in this kind of an experiment that it would mean they wouldn't be as involved in their own other type of community context as they might be otherwise. The one place where I think this might be really worth trying at some point is Israel. I think it would be an extraordinary thing to have an intentional ecumenical community in Jerusalem that brought together Messianic Jews, particularly with the Jewish Catholics and what they're doing. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But I'm throwing out possibilities here to try to stimulate all of your own dreams and your imagination for what could be. Now, I wanted to add, before moving on, a couple of other possibilities that could function as hubs in relationship to either local chavurot or virtual chavurot. One type of entity that could do that is a school, a Messianic Jewish school. Now, particularly if it actually had a local base that people could come to. But it's possible that something like Messianic Jewish Theological Institute could still function as a hub if it organized some kind of regular events, if it had some of its own staff assigned to help oversee some members of Chavurot. You can envision something like that happening. But also an institution like the Messianic Jewish Studies program at King's University, which is developing. It's still early to see what that's going to become, but David Rudolph is doing a marvelous job there, and who knows what could develop there. And the King's University, the Messianic Jewish Studies program, ultimately could, even in connection with some of the other Messianic Jewish institutions in Dallas, function as a hub that was supporting Chavurot in various places around the country or around the world. To show you how much I have matured and grown over the years, I want to offer to you the possibility that even a mission might be able to serve as a hub. In part because I've seen some of the changes that the missions have gone through over the years. And I look at particularly an institution like Chosen People and see how integrated they are with the Messianic Jewish movement and how their primary form of outreach is forming congregations. Sometimes those congregations become part of the UMJC, and then you say, well, really, what's the difference between, CPM and the UMJC or the MGRC or what I would conceive of as the Messianic Jewish movement? It's not, and so I would acknowledge that it's possible that missions could even function in this way as hubs. Particularly, though, they would have to be investing in Jewish life. That's a direction I think that they're going in, and they'd have to be as invested, in other words, in the discipleship, the maturing process of Jewish life as they were in winning, new people to Yeshua. I personally think that this is essential ultimately for the missions to be able to see, because of this tunnel period that I think that we're in, and how I think that we can't simply be focusing on the numbers of new people who are praying to receive Yeshua. We need to be focusing on building the kind of life such that our children grow up and continue that life, are drawn to it. And that our own people, once somebody comes into that life, that their life is reshaped and transformed. So those are my thoughts about models for the future of Messianic Judaism. I wanted to talk now just a little bit about goals of Messianic Jewish Keruv. Keruv, of course, it's a term that gets used in the Jewish world for outreach, but it comes from the Hebrew word for nearness, for being near or drawing near. In that sense, again, it's closely connected to this notion of intimacy that Rabbi Rich was speaking about earlier today. And I think it's important for us as we think about Messianic Jewish community to do what Rabbi Stewart challenges us to do in his book, Converging Destinies, which is to always think about the community in relationship to its calling, its mission, its purpose, and what we're ultimately about. And that means Keruv, as well as simply the worship of God and living our lives for the glory of God. Keruv is central to who we are, what we are as disciples of Yeshua. The first type of Keruv is to draw people nearer to Torah and Israel. This is what we are doing when we're dealing with those non-Jews of ambiguous status. You know, we're taking those who are on the margins, who are in the process, you might say, of being lost to the Jewish people. You know, they're in this kind of netherworld, you know, where they're no longer Jewish in any full sense. They're on their way to extinction as Jews, or their family line is. And yet, there's now a spark of something that's coming in, that's been lit up. And when we lead such people back into Jewish life, this is a tremendous mitzvah. You know, this is a mitzvah that is as significant as leading someone to Yeshua. We are saving a Jewish soul. Not just a soul, but a Jewish soul. Preserving another Jewish soul in the world. And of course, if you, as the Talmud says, you save a soul, you save a world. And of course, what that means is if you save that Jewish identity, there's the potential of all of their descendants being Jews. And so this is a beautiful, beautiful thing and crucial to us as Messianic Jews. I think it's as important to us as what people would think of as evangelism. And that we shouldn't treat it as something that's somehow less significant or less central to our mission, to what we are. The second aspect of Keruv, the second goal, is drawing people nearer to Yeshua. This obviously is also absolutely central to who we are. For us, of course, bringing people close to Yeshua is also bringing them close to Torah and to Israel. And so we find ourselves in the sort of situation that, you know, that Diane was talking about earlier today, where we are talking to a Jewish person who is not involved in Jewish religious life at all, but has some spiritual openness, and their interest, their curiosity is sparked by Yeshua, and we perhaps even are able to see them come to that point where they want Yeshua. But we don't stop with simply leading them to Yeshua, because then now we have another Jewish soul that needs to be saved as a Jewish soul. And we then take someone who, again, potentially was simply going to have children and grandchildren who were lost to the Jewish people, and now has the potential to have children and grandchildren who themselves will both be followers of Yeshua and loyal to the Jewish people. So these two really always, of course, for us, go together. bringing people near to Yeshua, bringing people near to Torah, bringing people near to Israel. And then there is that work of drawing near to one another. And what I mean here is, I'm not focusing now so much just on the drawing near within a particular community, but I'm focusing now on something I talked about the other day, which is the need for us as Messianic Jews to be ambassadors of reconciliation. Not to be those who are provoking new divisions. And so that means reaching across various lines. There are lines that have to be drawn. We, again, talked about that the other day. In order to have any kind of community life and community identity, you end up drawing certain lines. You say, within our community, this is what we are. This is the way we act. This is what we do. This is what we believe. This is what it means to be part of this community. But then, that doesn't mean that when you reach beyond those lines, that somehow you're compromising in any way. You are who you are, and now you reach out to others who share a lot of what you share, but don't share everything. This is why, for those of us in the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, it's crucial for us to be in active, contributing parts of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, fostering the unity of the Union, to be in relationships with other Messianic Jews from outside the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, to be in relationships with Jewish believers who are in various sorts of church contexts but recognize the significance of their Jewish identity, and to be fostering in the grand scheme of things a new converging relationship between the Jewish people as a whole and the church as a whole. All of this is part of our mission of Kiruv. We're not simply evangelists or those bringing people to Torah and Israel. We are also part of this bigger picture, trying to bring about the wholeness of the body of Messiah, the wholeness of the people of God. Finally, of course, there's simply the Kiruv that we all need, which is central to any of our communities. And again, this is one of the themes of Rabbi Rich's message this morning. Ultimately, it's a matter of our awe being drawn near through Yeshua in the Spirit to the Father. And it's this image of nearness, of course, which is central to the book of Ephesians. It uses this image of being drawn near. And this is the imagery of the temple, of course, of being drawn into the very presence of God. We, Israel, were already near, but in Yeshua we get brought nearer. The non-Jewish world was far away, and now it is brought near. And then we are together brought near, Jew and Gentile, through Yeshua and in the Spirit. That's the message of Ephesians, particularly chapters 1 through 3. Another way of describing what Rich was talking about actually is being a temple, being a Beit Mikdash. The ultimate goal is that the creation would be a temple, that the whole creation would be a place where God is glorified and worshipped. That is the ultimate Kiruv, where an all is brought near. So we're getting near the end here, and I began on Thursday night, long ago, by giving a list of leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement who were in their 80s and 70s and 60s, and then the younger ones in their upper 50s, and Over the next 10 to 15 years, we're passing on this movement to many of you. And we will be gradually getting out of the way and allowing you to spread your wings and make of this movement what you will make of it in Hashem. You'll be the ones making those decisions pretty soon, not too long. I wanted to point out one thing that is different about this next generation of leaders, and I referred to it again, perhaps on the first day. The baby boomer leaders, by and large, had two Jewish parents and grew up in relatively intact Jewish communities. And so for many of us, we didn't need to get Jewishly enculturated in any way. We had that. We didn't necessarily have the religious education, and for some of us, we realized that and went back and got it. Those who didn't, at least they still had that Jewish enculturation from the beginning. This generation of leaders does not have what we had. There may be a few exceptions. Of course, there are some who have two Jewish parents, but even those who have two Jewish parents, some of you grew up in the Messianic Jewish movement, which affects the type of experience you had of Jewish community. And even if you grew up in something like a Jewish community, the Jewish community isn't what it was before. I'm amazed at how much has already been lost to many segments of the Jewish community. When I was growing up, our family, conservative Jews, I was not at all involved in synagogue life. I was one of those kids who got prepared for bar mitzvah and had the bar mitzvah and then said goodbye, But my dad was very involved in Jewish life. He was very involved. He was the president of the synagogue. He went to daily services. But none of that was brought home. We didn't celebrate Shabbat together. Our home, the home life was no different than a secular Jewish family. But when my grandfather died, and we sat Shiva for my grandfather, you would have thought we were an Orthodox Jewish family. For that week, the mirrors are all covered. We're all walking around in our bare feet. We had these folding chairs lined up in the living room for the daily services that were taking place. It was. So I grew up. I knew what Shiva was, and I didn't have to be taught that. I didn't have to study it. It was just that was something I knew. It wasn't just that my one grandfather, it was other grandparents. We sat Shiva several times in our house. A few years ago, my wife's brother passed away, and his funeral, was in Baltimore, where she was from, and we sat Shiva for a few days in the family. The family is ostensibly Orthodox. It grew up Orthodox, but each generation has gone further and further away from that, and there are very few people within the family who are engaged in Jewish religious life. And I was stunned because we were sitting Shiva, and we did have daily services within the house. I was one of the people leading them, because I was the most Jewishly literate. And there were certain things that I was shocked that people didn't know about what you do in a house of Shiva. It was stunning to me. These are Jews, they should know this. There's some things like this about Jewish life that are just dissolving among us. Outside, again, those who are very seriously Orthodox in their life. What I'm just leading to is something actually that most of you know and have already done, and I'm more just pointing out to you something that's probably obvious to you. For the next generation and for the generation after that, you're going to have to invest in learning Judaism and learning Yiddishkeit. It's not something that just came to you with your mother's milk. You have to put yourself in Jewish environments, not just Messianic Jewish environments. The Messianic Jewish environments, in most cases, will not be sufficient to give you the actual taste that you need to get. You need to find ways of experiencing Jewish life in the wider Jewish community. Israel is one good way of doing that. But particularly if you find the right religious settings in Israel and not simply the secular or the Messianic ones. So if we are to have long-term a type of Messianic Judaism that preserves what needs to be preserved and preserves and which develops in an authentic direction, this is something that's going to have to be consciously undertaken. It's not always easy for us to do this, to be in those environments, but I think you're going to have to do it. And I think, as I said, from what I've observed, you're already doing it. Now, I want to conclude with a bit of a scripture study that's a little different than what I've done so far. It's still a study of Acts, in this case also with a text from Luke, but it's not one passage. It's a set of passages that all relate to one topic. And it's something that I think is a good way to conclude this study. And it's something from Luke and Acts that's often unnoticed. So, whoops. Should be a list of the scripture passages. Oh, maybe it didn't show up on the slides. I thought it was part of the... Well, it's not crucial. Again, I will tell you what the scripture texts are. What I wanted to talk about in Luke and Acts is the daily offering in the temple. It's called the tamid offering. Tamid is the Hebrew word that means continually, and it's a term that gets used in the Torah and in rabbinic literature to describe the daily offering, the daily sacrifice in the temple that was offered in the morning and then in the afternoon, mid-afternoon. Numbers 28, verses 1 through 8, describes the tamid offering. This is significant. The tamid is very significant because it's the basis for the recitation of the Amidah in the Shachrit and Mincha service. The Amidah itself is a priestly prayer and has elements in it that seem to go back to temple times. And in the rabbinic understanding, the Amidah is a priestly temple prayer. That's why it's called the Amidah and is recited standing. You stand because priests, Kohanim, when they're functioning in the temple, stand. And of course, the Amidah is recited in any particular time when when offerings are offered. That's why we have the Musaf Amidah on Shabbat or the holidays. It corresponds to when the Musaf Korbanot offerings were offered within the temple. Now, the first text where this shows up and is important in Luke is the first chapter of Luke, when Zechariah, who is a Kohen, he's a priest, he's functioning in Jerusalem, he's in the temple, and we get this picture of him offering incense in the temple. Oh, it looks like they got him. No, yes you did. the offering of incense was part of the liturgy of the Tamid. And so Zechariah is participating as a Kohen in this particular sacrifice. And he's praying. Notice the emphasis on prayer. Because when angel Gabriel appears to him, he says, your prayer has been answered. Now, we're not told what that prayer is. People sometimes think, well, maybe that prayer, he was praying for a son, and the prayer was answered. I think that's less likely. Zechariah is so surprised, that he can't really believe Zechariah, or the angel Gabriel. Now, if an angel came to me, and even if I was old, as I am, and told me I was going to have a son, well, I'd believe him. I think that's pretty believable. I think it's more likely that his prayer is the same prayer that the other Israelites are praying in the courts, which is a prayer for the coming of the Mashiach. It's a prayer for the coming of the kingdom. It's the prayer for everything ultimately to be consummated and wrapped up. Another reason for believing this is Luke chapter 1 seems to be alluding back to Daniel chapter 9. You recall Daniel chapter 9 is that chapter where Daniel is praying and meditating on this text from Jeremiah that speaks about the 70 years of exile that will occur. And then what he's told is it's not just 70 years, it's 70 weeks of years. And ultimately, though, that exile ends with the coming of the kingdom, of Malchut Shamayim. So, and remember, it says that Daniel is praying at the time of the afternoon offering, the afternoon Tamid. So he's praying towards Jerusalem, even though the temple has been destroyed and the Tamid is not being offered at that point. Daniel is still keeping those times as the times of prayer, just as Jews have done since 70, even when the temple was destroyed. And fundamentally, the Amidah still today is a prayer for the coming of the Mashiach. That's really fundamentally what the Amidah is. It's the same thing Daniel was praying for, and the same thing that Zechariah was praying for in Luke chapter 1. So we have the Tamid offering, we have prayer, and then what we also have is an emphasis on the gift of the Spirit. Because what Zechariah is told is that you are going to have a son born to you, and he's going to be filled with the Spirit, basically from conception. And you know that when Miriam comes to Elizabeth, and the baby moves in Elizabeth's womb, that's a sign, again, that Yochanan is already filled with the Spirit, even in his mother's womb. So we have this constellation, the Tamid offering, prayer, particularly prayer for the coming of the kingdom, and the gift of the Spirit. Now, this constellation gets replayed in the book of Acts. The first place where it gets replayed, I think, is at Shavuot, Pentecost. Now, in Acts chapter 1, we're told that we have the 120 followers of Yeshua, and it says that they're gathering for prayer constantly. Every day they are gathering for prayer. That is between the time when Yeshua has ascended into heaven and when the Spirit falls on Shavuot. So they are praying. And then we have the Spirit coming upon them on the day of Shavuot. And then after the people see them and they're all saying, are they all drunk? Are they intoxicated? What's up? And then the answer is no, because it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Now that looks like an incidental detail, like just saying, well, yes, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, no one would be drunk at this time. I think the key reason for the mention of 9 o'clock is, again, that's the time when the Tamid offering is being offered in the temple. So, somewhat implicitly in Acts 2, we have this connection of the offering in the temple, the prayer of the disciples of Yeshua, and the outpouring of the Spirit. Now, the connection with Israel's prayer and the Tamid also is seen in the very next chapter, chapter 3, verse 1. Because in chapter 3, verse 1, we read about Peter and John going up to the temple at the hour of prayer, it says. The hour of prayer. The hour of prayer, what's the hour of prayer? That's the hour of the Tamid. But because prayer was so associated with the Tamid already, they could call the hour of the Tamid offering the hour of prayer. And what we see here is the disciples are going up at the hour of prayer, meaning they're going to participate in the communities, the whole prayer of the Jewish people in the temple at that time. They're going to participate in the liturgy of the Tamid, the same liturgy that we read about in Luke chapter 1. That same liturgy which ultimately itself is a prayer for the coming of the Messiah, just as the Amidah is, just as Daniel's prayer was. But I think where it especially gets interesting is then when we look to Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10 describes Cornelius, this righteous Gentile. And it says that he is praying, and he's someone who prays regularly and offers tzedakah. You know, and that it's his tzedakah and his prayers that rise up to God. Now, I think most of you are familiar enough with Jewish prayer to know that, you know, at a weekday service, there's the custom of having the tzedakah box and of putting money in the tzedakah box in connection with the recitation of the Amidah. The two go together. And it's Cornelius's prayer and his tzedakah, which rise up before God. And what we're told is it's at the time of the afternoon Tamid when he's doing this. And who comes to him? It's Gabriel again, who came to Zechariah in Luke chapter 1 at the time of the morning Tamid, who came to Daniel to reveal to him the basic order of the coming of the Mashiach at the afternoon Tamid. So Cornelius has the revelation. He sends for Peter. Peter comes to Caesarea, and Peter is talking. He gives the message of Yeshua, and before he does, Cornelius explains to him what happened to him several days before. And again, a little notice detail. He says, and as he's telling his story, is it was at the same hour as it is now. In other words, they're having the conversation at the hour of the Tamid. And that's when the Spirit comes to Cornelius. Again, notice this connection. The Tamid offering ordained in the Torah, the prayer of the disciples of Yeshua and the Jewish people for the coming of the Mashiach, and the gift of the Spirit, which is a kind of foretaste of the life of the kingdom to come. Now, there's a lot, I think, here that one could say about what the significance of all of this is. I mean, one of the things that I find so interesting, you know, is that it's the morning Tamid when the Jewish disciples of Yeshua receive the Spirit, and the afternoon Tamid is when the Gentiles receive it. It's almost like the Tamid institution itself has this typological prophetic dimension to it. And whereas the Spirit comes directly to the Jewish disciples of Yeshua, it was mediated through the Jewish disciples of Yeshua for Cornelius. It's not like Cornelius prayed and then the Spirit just came down. He had to call for Peter. But the point I want to stress, really, in relationship to everything that we've been talking about, is how the Tamid is this fundamental corporate institution of Jewish life. It's something that all the Jewish people share. And what we have is the apostles and the disciples entering into it fully, engaging in it completely, orienting their prayer in relationship to this prayer, the prayer of the community. And yet, it's this very traditional, liturgical act which results ultimately in the outburst of the Spirit of God and all of this charismatic phenomena and basically all heaven breaking loose, you know? And also leads to new things that no one expected. I mean, the Spirit falling on these goyim who weren't circumcised and weren't going to become circumcised. Who expected that? In other words, it's in these disciples being rooted so firmly in the life of the Jewish people and in the tradition and in the community that then leads to the newness and the innovation and a kind of rupture even, but it's the rupture of the Spirit and the work of the Spirit. And so I think we have to keep these things together. And the kind of community life that we're talking about for the future of Messianic Judaism has to be a community of the Tamid and a community of prayer and a community of the Spirit. It has to be all of them. And it's a community of prayer that's in continuity with and in fellowship with the Jewish people as a whole. You know, we praying Shachrit, praying Mincha, along with every other observant Jew around the world, praying the Amidah, which is fundamentally this prayer for the coming of the kingdom of God, praying it in Yeshua and praying it with the hope and the expectation that God is going to answer. And in this century, we will see the Spirit poured out in new ways, in ways that none of us expect. I mean, I laid out for you some ideas of what of possible future directions. I'm sure I haven't touched on a fraction of what Hashem has in mind and what Hashem is going to do. I couldn't. No one knows the surprises of Hashem, the surprises of the Ruach. But what we do know is that if we root ourselves in this life and what God has already shown to us, we can have confidence and faith that the Spirit will come to us and we'll experience ourselves a new Shavuot for the Messianic Jewish movement, for the Jewish people as a whole, and for the church, for all the nations of the world. Okay, well, so we have a little bit of time for some more questions and discussion. Okay, start them off.
I have a question. Hi, great session. My question is regarding one of the models, well, actually in multiple models that you discussed tonight as far as community, Messianic Jewish community in the future. The term long-term was often talked about in developing trusting relationships and being with people for many, many years. I feel like time and time again I see studies of millennials that are that basically reveal that millennials move a lot. Yes. They switch jobs a lot. Just to give two examples. Is that just a challenge and a tension that we'll have to deal with, or have you thought about maybe what that would look like, or maybe go ahead.
No, exactly. I think this is that mobility factor is itself one of the key features, I think, that is contributing to the disruption of the social fabric and the breakdown of relationships and long-term, the type of community support that human beings need. I simply don't think long term that it's a sustainable way for human beings to live, much less for a community of the followers of Yeshua or the Jewish people. And so, now, I'm not saying that that people should never move, obviously. In every given case, there's all kinds of different factors, and I'm not giving anybody individual counsel for what you should do or shouldn't do. But in terms of overall patterns of life, I think that if we think that one of the most important things for our life, if you as an individual think that one of the most important things in your life that you exist for is to contribute to the future of Messianic Judaism, then some sacrifices are going to have to be made somewhere along the line. And and everyone's going to have to decide what they are. But basically, when job opportunity trumps everything else, basically it's a sign of the priorities in one's life. And I think with millennials, again, it's for me, again, a reflection of the fact that everyone is chasing their own dream. And that's kind of it's the ultimate manifestation of the American vision of life. Everybody chases their own dream, and you just wish everyone else well in chasing their dream. But you can't build community that way. Everybody chasing their own dream ultimately leads to just a bunch of fragmented, independent beings, separated from one another. Marriage itself, you just think about building a family. Building a family means two parties deciding that, and these days, in most cases, both the husband and the wife have career paths. But if you're going to have a marriage, somebody's going to have to sacrifice. You have to make a decision, You're not going to be able to count on the fact that in every occasion, you're going to be able to go somewhere where both parties can have an ideal job for themselves. You make a decision together about what you're going to do. And I think we have to find ways in the future to make these sorts of decisions with one another rather than just independently. And to make decisions where we're not just chasing our own independent dreams, but where we're chasing a corporate dream, a community dream together.
Thank you.
Again, Rabbi Mark, that was a very excellent lecture. How do you foresee the fact that there's some teaching ministries like First Fruits of Zion that are producing excellent material after material after material? Do you see that there needs to be a continuous production of material, or how do you foresee the educational aspect? You touched a little bit about it, getting involved with the mainstream Jewish community, but what do you see as far as scholarship within the Messianic Jewish community, and what do you see as the academic future?
Yes. Well, I do think that this is a very important part of Messianic Jewish life, and I think we've got now some really good educational institutions. You yourself have partaken of this, and we're already a good way ahead of where we were 20 years ago on this front. But we can't rest on our laurels. These things have to develop. Each institution has to grow and mature. And part of what this means is more Messianic Jewish scholars. And we'll need to replace our current batch. Fortunately, we've got a set of young scholars or younger scholars There are a few people who are in grad school and doing the kind of study that will enable them to be that in the future. But I think we need more. So yes, this is an area where we've already made progress, but we need to continue to make progress. We need excellent quality materials on every front. I mean, really, one can point to just almost any area where we need more of this and we need more of that, you know? I, though, see progress. Again, it's one of the advantages of age, you know, is you see certain things over an extended period of time, and it gives you a different perspective on things. Those of us who have seen up close the Messianic Jewish movement over a 40-year period or 50-year period, at least I have observed, and Rabbi Rich has seen it even more closely in those earlier years. We've really matured in so many ways. Really, I mean, it's easy to long for the early days, and remember when we were more dynamic and growing and all, et cetera. But really, things were pretty chaotic and crazy at the same time. Leadership was rather unstable, and relationships were continually getting broken, and we had no scholarship to speak of. And we had none of our own educational institutions. And really, there's a lot of good that's come. And as I mentioned before, I think the direction of more unity and more love, and it opens all kinds of doors for more fruitfulness in the future. So all I just say is yes, more. Okay, you'll have to go on.
So I had a question about your perspective on the different models in a meta kind of way. You'd mentioned, and it seemed by your comments that you were kind of pointing away from synagogues in general. Is this more of a morphology that you're expecting in the kind of life of the synagogue, or more of like a putting the synagogue and the denomination sort of in a hospice care because of current development trends within Judaism in general, or just within Messianic Judaism in particular? Could you give some clarity on like the comparison between those two?
The two, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear everything that you were saying.
Sure. So are you mainly commenting on the morphology needed for Messianic Jewish life to continue based on current trends, or are you commenting in more of a sense on current trends within the three landscapes that we talked about previously, with less communal life being appropriate and being able to accomplish that, if you will, and so saying let's make sure we have communal life, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's probably because it's 8:40 and I've given 5 presentations, but I'm having a difficult time following
Okay, then I'll just break it down into 2 questions. The first question is is your view of the most opportunity for Messianic Jewish space based on the trends that have been going on with a lot of Gentiles coming into synagogues, synagogues being difficult to grow, etc., is question number 1. And the question number 2, is this also in conjunction with developments in the mainstream Jewish space, which makes synagogue life difficult to do in general?
Okay, yes.
I'm sorry for the confusion.
Yeah, no, I think it's both. I think it's clearly, I think it's the trends that exist right now. I think it's in our own internal movement and trying to read where things might go in the future. It is also, though, looking at the wider Jewish world and in a certain sense the Christian world too. I mean, another way of looking at this is in relationship to the rise of the nuns, and the alienation from institutional forms. And the Chavurah model is a much more flexible type of model that gives a lot more freedom. It's obviously less institutionalized. But then if these Chavurot have some kind of organic connection to some kind of hub institution, it can ground it and give it some kind of longer-term stability. So I think it's a response to all of those things That's why this is sort of my way of trying to pull together a lot of the strands from the different presentations.
Mark, if I could offer a challenge to all of you sitting here, especially the younger crowd among us, one of the major concerns that some of us have about the Chavurah model, though we're very in favor of for the future, is the difficulty in relating to our children in this sense. On Tuesday night, the Chavurah meets and we love Yeshua. But on Saturday, kiddies, we're going to synagogue. Don't say anything about him. They don't understand. A 7-year-old can't accommodate that. It is an invitation for the kids when they become teenagers to say this whole thing is too confusing, too nuts, too bifurcated. They won't use that word. The challenge I want to offer is what is desperately going to be needed in the years ahead are some of you who love children, who have some background in childhood development and educational structure, and to be able to provide a virtual Shabbat school or Hebrew school or some similar structure so that kids from all over the world, or the English-speaking world, can gather together and have as much of a consistent sense of Messianic Jewish participation that isn't limited to the little group on Tuesday night, and which will help to mitigate some of the negative effects of having to edit themselves for public consumption, whether they're in a church or a synagogue on Saturday. I offer that, or Sunday, I offer that as a challenge. It is the biggie in terms of the future of emerging, maturing Messianic Judaism.
Yeah, thank you, Rich.
Hey, Rabbi and Mark, I have the mic over here. My question is just in relation, you suggested that it's going to be necessary for us to learn from the wider Jewish world and to be involved in other Jewish communities. You know, there are cases, you know, that I think a lot of us know about when, you know, there's occasional scenarios where where we'll lose people from Messianic Judaism into that world because of various reasons. Yeah. And also I've even heard voices from the Orthodox anti-missionary world that at times even finding a silver lining in Messianic Judaism as being, you know, kind of affirming that route as Messianic Judaism as the route back into Judaism, ultimately leaving, you know, Messianic Judaism. But nevertheless, like, I mean, I know for us, like at Ruach House, and a lot of us even discussions last night where we grapple with this and, like, you know, see the need to grow in and authentically learn Judaism, you know, and to understand it from the inside, and not just even more than just going through the motions of like learning like when to bow and, you know, and whatnot. Yeah. But really studying and learning. But yeah, so like maybe you comment on that, and then also to what extent and like how long and how far does it go that like we, like, at what point can we just be satisfied with where we're at in here, and like and be kind of legitimate, you know, Judaism in and of ourselves.
Yes.
And how do you balance all that out?
Yeah, it's a very good point, because we have to frankly acknowledge the risks we take in any of these directions that we make, and that is one of the risks. I mean, I'm not recommending that anybody make involvement in the wider Jewish community their primary community experience. I think what I'm referring to is a kind of supplemental type of participation where you are doing it in a very deliberate way as a learner, as well as someone who's simply committed to the Jewish community as a whole and expressing it in certain ways. I've continued to participate in a conservative shul, for I was part of. I've never been able to be a member of it, but I started attending in 1974, and then attended weekly until 1993 when we started our own Messianic Jewish congregation, and then when my mother passed away in the year 2000, I went back to the conservative shul to say Kaddish for my mom, and then that led me back into a friendship with the rabbi, and since that time I went back and have been going on every Friday night and every Tuesday night to the daily minyan on Tuesday nights, and this is important to me, but I don't relate to that as my primary community. It's something I do that expresses my commitment to the Jewish community as a whole. And when earlier in my life, before 1993, frankly, it was where I learned Judaism. I didn't really. I described to you my upbringing, and so you can know I didn't learn Judaism at my father's knee. I learned Judaism in this conservative synagogue after I was already a follower of Yeshua. But I had the advantage of, for 19 years, just participating in a very solid, sound Jewish community before actively participating in the wider Messianic Jewish community. Even there, though, it was not my primary community. I was involved in this ecumenical thing, doing stuff all over the world. It was something that I was doing that was supplementary to my core community commitment. And so I think that's the first thing, is to be very clear on one's priorities and one's community life. One of the things, Rabbi Rich referred earlier to the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council and this shift we made in our approach to halakha. And one of the reasons we made that shift is for the very reason you mentioned, Shlomi, which was realizing if all we did is said, well, we're just a road to lead people back to traditional halakha, then the message we're really giving is, okay, Messianic Judaism is just a road back to Orthodox Judaism. And implicitly, we were conveying that message. What we're now trying to say is, no, being a Messianic Jew means that there are distinctive halachic positions that only we will take because of our recognition of both the coming of Yeshua, the coming of the Spirit, the inclusion of the Gentiles, the authority of the New Testament. Because of all of these things, we will end up with halachic positions which on certain matters are distinct. And we're only at the beginning of articulating all of those. We need to get very clear on them and then be able to truly assimilate them into our life in a way that then we have inner clarity about these things as we're going into environments within the wider Jewish world.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up?
Sure.
At what point do we not have to go outside to learn real Judaism? Yeah. At what point can we learn it from within here?
Well, you see, I think that's something everyone will have to decide for themselves. As I said, for me, it was not like I didn't decide it. It's simply there were a certain number of those years for me in that conservative synagogue that were clearly educational, where I was learning all the time. At a certain point, that was no longer the case, and at that point, what I was doing was going just to express my commitment to the Jewish people, and that I was a Jew and I was part of the wider community, whether I was accepted in that way or not. In that sense, I was bearing witness to a certain truth, and willing to accept the subordinate position in order to bear witness to that truth. So I think that's, at a certain point, the reason for participation changes. But I don't think that some sort of participation should ever change. I mean, I think there's some level of connection with the wider Jewish world that is important for all of us to maintain in some way. It's going to be very different for each of us. Our lives are so busy, you can only fill a life so much, you know. But for those of you who are young, who are going to be the leaders of the next generation, you have to be thinking in these somewhat deliberate terms about how you're structuring your Jewish life.
Yeah, Rabbi
Okay.
Mark, I come from a different background than most people here. I realize this temple is very pro-Jewish and pro-Orthodoxy and conservative. But I went 10 years to a new view. I went to Protestant church for 10 years. And now I'm back at Ruach, and I realize this is where my friends are, and so people love me here. I mean, I feel I have a lot of friends here. I never made any friends in church. And now I come here one day, and I'm saying hi to everybody. So I mean, it's wonderful to be welcomed back. And you talk about the Messianic movement wants to be accepted by Jewish theologians and Jewish Orthodox, conservative and Orthodox Jewish theology. But it also wants to be accepted by those that believe in Jesus, the church, the Protestant and the Catholic Church. They want to equally be accepted by the church as well as be accepted by the Jewish faith. They want to be accepted by both. And what is your view about being accepted by the church? You haven't talked much about that.
Yeah, well, I would want to put it a little differently than that, in that I wouldn't want to use the language of wanting to be accepted exactly. The reason is that it could imply, I don't think this is necessarily what you were implying, I think though that it's what the words could imply, is that we're doing it out of some kind of emotional need, you know, that we need to be accepted. And if we're not accepted somehow or another, it doesn't legitimate us. And I think there's no way you can make it as a Messianic Jew if that's the approach that you're taking, you know. We have to get very clear in who we are, and can't be operating out of some kind of psychological need to be accepted by the others. The issue from my point of view is not so much our need, it is their need. It's their need. The church needs to affirm Messianic Judaism because until it does, it's missing something fundamental about its own identity. The Jewish world needs to be able to, if even grudgingly, acknowledge the Messianic Judaism as a legitimate form of Judaism in order for something in its own identity to truly be released and opened up. And so yes, I think part of our goal is a change in both of these environments, but it's not for our sake, it's for their sake, and for the sake ultimately of their relationship with one another. It's only when both the church and the Jewish people realize something fundamental about the legitimacy of Messianic Jewish faith that they can actually see one another as having a kind of relationship that they never realized they had. So.
Right, so.
Okay, well, one more.
And we got two.
Okay.
Okay. So it's a two-part question, but maybe a short answer. So your generation, and I know I'm in it, but the leaders who had their experience 30 years ago were really, it was something supernatural that they experienced. And my question is twofold. I don't really know in this generation of leaders if their experience was firsthand or whether in some cases they were second generation and are in this religion because it was what they were brought up in. So my question is, do we know generally how many are the first case like you guys and the second case like second generation? And if there are a significant number of young leaders who are of that second group, what are some of the recommendations or obstacles or thoughts that you have for that group?
Yes. This, now, I don't have statistics on this, and I don't know if they exist. I simply have my own personal observations in that I think the majority or the larger number of the leaders of the coming generation are second generation themselves. They're either raised in a Messianic Jewish context, or they were raised in an intermarried context where they were exposed to both, Christianity, Yeshua, and Judaism, and ultimately came to a place of putting them together. So it might have been new for them, but that where Yeshua wasn't new. So now, some people, depending on the type of theology and spirituality you've had, some people would think, oh, that's a problem, because to not had some kind of dramatic Damascus Road experience, hinders your capacity to do what needs to be done in leadership. I think it's just, I don't buy that at all. I think that in fact, the whole Damascus Road thing is essential for the beginning of something new. That's always going to be the case. When there's something completely new on the scene, there's got to be some sort of dramatic intervention that changes something. But I think the course in which things normally work in God's working in the world, both in the Jewish people and the church, has been with the transmission of life from one generation to the next. There will always be, in the midst of that, certain kinds of disjunctions and radical changes and interventions of God. But I don't think it should be the norm. I mean, I really think the norm should be someone growing up with faith in the God of Israel and in Yeshua from childhood and simply growing up into it without ever being able to say, when did they give their life to Yeshua? When did they come to know Yeshua? I think that's the way it should be. I regret that I spent the first 19 years of my life without that. I think I'm less whole of a person because of that. So I think it's a good thing that for this next generation of leaders, and at the same time, there is this need to continue to pray for that next outpouring of the Holy Spirit that opens doors in dramatic new ways for lots of other people. Ultimately, for Jewish people in the future who are come to know Yeshua, they're going to need these kinds of breakthroughs again. And so we need to continue to look for that to happen and to pray for it to happen. But I don't regret the new phase that we're in.
We have one more question over here.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Rabbi Kinzer. So Shlomi kind of asked a similar question I was going to ask, so I'm going to ask a different one. You said yesterday that, really orthodoxy, that's where they are. They're the ones that are really still practicing authentic Judaism. In 20, 30 years, they're going to be a larger portion. If we get more serious about our Judaism in the Messianic movement, do you see the inevitable partnering? Not so much, at the end of the time, end of days, but before, between us, if we're practicing an authentic Judaism, whereas the Reform and conservative movements are kind of not at that time.
Yes. I do think, of course, I'm not making long-term predictions for any of these movements. They will likely still exist in some way, but I think unless they experience some fairly radical changes, it's hard to see them, their future in any rosy light. Whereas I think there's no reason to expect that orthodoxy will not continue in a fairly strong way. I think we can also, for other reasons which I won't be able to go into for lack of time. And I do think that longevity is going to make a difference here. I attended a lecture last week that was given by an Israeli scholar of Jewish-Christian relations. And she was asked a question about Messianic Judaism. And she's someone who I know and who is actually sympathetic and open to us as Messianic Jews, thinks we should be taken more seriously than we are. And she was commenting on the fact that, we're still not, she was particularly reflecting on the Israeli scene, that, the Jewish world in Israel still does not, will not take us, accept us as Jews or accept our Judaism as Judaism. But she said, she said, I have met the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Messianic Jews. And she says, and I think that the more that this continues over time, and it becomes clear that they are not going away, that the wider Jewish world is going to have to take notice and will take notice. So I'm expecting a change. But we have to be in it for the long haul. We really have to be very, very, very patient. And the very fact of hanging in there and becoming more stronger in our own Jewish life and identity, persevering and enduring, I firmly believe that there's going to be a change in this century, and probably in your lifetime, maybe not in mine, but in your lifetime. May you live to 120.
Mark, thank you so much. But before you go, I think it would be appropriate to do two things. Number one, I'm wondering if you could just say a blessing on all of us. Can you do that?
Yes.
And then after that, I'd like to invite Rabbi Nathan Joyner to come up to say a few words. I have a few words to say, and then I want him to come up. I'm putting you on the spot here, Rabbi Nathan. Could you talk a little bit about your vision for these conferences, and specifically the Judith McNutt conference coming? So that'd be really great. Mark, say a word of blessing. In fact, you say a word, and I want to say a word. Okay, why not?
Okay,
the old guys. Anyone see my false teeth? They're around here somewhere. Why don't you all stand? All stand for a minute. And Rabbi Mark, you go first,
Sure.
and then I want to say a blessing too.
May Adonai pour out his love and his grace upon you. May you be deeply rooted in your knowledge of him, in your knowledge of Mashiach Yeshua, in your experience of the work of the Ruach in your lives. May you be knit together in love. May each of you find your place, the place for which he has called you. May you find your story in the midst of his story, in the midst of the story of his people. May you find your dream in the midst of his dream for this world, his dream for Israel, his dream for the body of Mashiach. May you find yourself in him, and may you take your place in him, and may you fulfill his purpose for the coming decades. And may you be a light to all who come after you. B'Shem Yeshua HaMashiach Adonenu.
Amen. And I want to pray for all of you, that may you, at the level of your personal lives, find love, find health, find happiness, find the measure of prosperity that would be good for you. May your joy be sky high. And may you live lives so filled with love and goodness, both the receiving and the giving, that when it's time for you to meet your Maker, you'll be able to look back and go, it was a great ride. Thank you, Lord God.
Amen. Amen.
Amen. Amen. I'm going to ask Rabbi Nathan to come up. Let me just say that, Rabbi Nathan, we owe you a lot of gratitude, too, because this this conference was largely your vision. And I think we should acknowledge that. And I just want to say, as a senior rabbi here, having an associate rabbi like you makes my life a joy. Thank you for being you, and that's the truth.
And thank you for being you.
Having
a senior rabbi mentor like this.
Fuzzy and that's right.
Is this on? Well, we all want to go home, so I'll be really quick here. But we've had a vision here at Ruach for the past, growing over the past few years, but really coming to fruition, over the past few months here in September, to really be just like what Rabbi Mark was saying. It was so just perfect, really, to be a hub in Boston and in our country and beyond. And we hope to be one of many Messianic Jewish hubs. And this conference is an example of that, a beginning of that. One thing that we would like to do is be able to host events like this. And the idea is to do one fall time like this that's more theology-based, Jewish life-based, Jewish living, things like that. We're still working out what that's going to look like long-term in terms of the specifics. And then another one in the spring, which picks up on healing and an awakening of the Ruach, a term that we've coined here called a Jewish healing reawakening that we're really feel called to pioneer and work with. But we want both of these things to come together and to grow together, hence one more theologically Jewish life-based and then one more healing orientation to help us grow in these areas. So we actually have an exciting conference coming up in April. Shana, do you have the dates for that? I knew you'd know. The 26th to the 28th, is that right? Okay, of April. And we're having a very interesting speaker. We're having Judith McNutt from Jacksonville, Florida, with a group from Christian Healing Ministries. Now, this will be bilateral ecclesiology happening here during that weekend. Judith McNutt is married to Francis McNutt, who pioneered, or was one of the pioneers of the charismatic Catholic movement that Rabbi Mark spoke so much about and was a part of. He pioneered that movement, or a part of pioneering that movement, and because of that, they come with a way to integrate the Spirit into a liturgical framework, and it really fits what we're all about. So that's why we're having her come and share with us, and so I hope you guys can make it. Again, the last weekend of April. And then we'll be in touch, and we'll be in touch with you about these recordings and what we're going to do with them and how that's going to happen down the road.
Yeah, and on that one, just thank you, Rabbi Nathan. It's going to be hard to get a spot at that Judith McNutt conference because she is such a heavy hitter that we're going to pack this place out in 5 minutes, and it'll be probably a little more costly in experience, too, for everybody. But I want to know, Shana, are there any last things we need to do to get the sanctuary spick and span and the function hall spick and span for the congregations that meet here on Sunday mornings?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. We are doing one final moment of book sales tonight, so if you would like to purchase any of Rabbi Mark's books, please see Sue, who I don't see anymore, so see me. And then if anyone can just stay for 10 to 15 minutes after, just come see me, and I can give you kind of just a little bit of responsibility to help clean this place up because we do have churches meeting here tomorrow morning. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but hope you have safe travels home, wherever you're going.
Thank you, Shana, and thank you for all you've done. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Come back again. See us again soon. Shalom, shalom.